Welcome to the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County's online educational series. We're glad you could join us today. We're grateful to all our sponsors, but this week we're especially grateful to Brunk Auctions, world-class consignments and exceptional results. For this week, we're going to presume you have watched the previous slide presentations and skip quickly over things. This is me. To recap, Jake and Leah Chiles, Kenilworth Inn, the town of Kenilworth and Chiles Avenue as microcosms that allow us to explore topics that impacted the greater world around it. I got much of this information by exploring local newspapers throughout the history we cover. In 1998, on my way back from studying in Nairobi, Kenya, I visited Israel and was in Jerusalem for the Christian Holy Week. I thought it would be a great opportunity to find out what it would be like to be Christian in a place my religion holds dear during one of its special weeks. It was a zoo. I won't speak for other religions, but if you want to develop cynicism, visit one of these special places during Easter week. Oddly, I was often mistaken for being Jewish. There are groups that try to recruit Jewish people from elsewhere to move to Israel, and I was approached numerous times. I was at Ein Gedi Reserve at the Dead Sea, and a man engaged me in conversation. At one point, he said something in Hebrew, and I apologized, telling him I don't speak the language. Jokingly, he chastised me, telling me, "Oh, bad Jew." When I told him I actually wasn't Jewish, he took me through the family backgrounds of several of my relatives before retreating, a bit embarrassed. I thought it was kind of funny and endearing in a way. Then there was a night I was walking through an old part of Jerusalem, and a group of young men called out something to me from across the square. "Sorry, what?" I asked in a cheerful tone. "Jew boy, you walk alone, you die alone," they said. I started to explain, but decided a quick retreat was more prudent. Going to Jerusalem to find out what it was like to be a Christian during Easter had turned into a lesson on what it was like to be Jewish in Israel every day. The result of that experience was to leave Velcro-type hooks in my consciousness that snagged references to Jewish names, organizations, and temples while I was doing my research on Chiles Avenue when we first moved here. And that made me wonder, why so many Jewish families? Why Asheville? So when this series came along, I knew it was another great filter to examine how Chiles Avenue was again a microcosm of Asheville. There's an old saying that goes, "I'd have made this shorter, but I didn't have the time." I put these videos together in 1 week from research to posting, and the topic of the Jewish history in Asheville is far greater than can be covered here, so I ask forgiveness in advance to those who know this history far better than I. The first Jewish arrivals came around 1880 along with the railroad. The first temple was established in 1891. Why North Carolina? Why Asheville? Many attribute this to, of all people, Zebulon Vance, slave owner, racist, Confederate-era governor, whose monument sits in Pack Square. The story goes that when Vance was being taken to prison after the war and was going to be forced to walk, a Jewish hatmaker offered to take him in his carriage. They became friends. Vance would defend the rights of Jewish legislators to be seated in the state legislature and would make a famous speech called The Scattered Nation, defending the Jewish population, comparing them to the Gulf Stream and the ocean that exists within but as a separate entity. It was noted that there were fewer than 500 Jews in all of North Carolina, so it wasn't as if he were doing this for political gain. This gave a sense that North Carolina and Asheville in particular were a place where Jews would be tolerated or even welcomed. When the Vance Monument was dedicated, the Daughters of the Confederacy and B'nai B'rith both laid wreaths. The Jewish population increased and began to create a lasting impact on Asheville, from its economy to the architecture that makes Asheville so desirable a place to visit and move to today. This is a people who came from elsewhere, like many of us, including my own family. They jumped in and got organized, leading to Asheville's Jewish population being described as one of the most organized Jewish communities in the state. In 1998, after my trip to Jerusalem, I went to get my master's degree in public administration at Harvard. I was transitioning from being a political consultant to doing policy work. And when I had to pick a policy area, I thought, hey, I think this internet thing is going to catch on. That's when I learned the internet is a network of networks. We connect them to pass along information, knowledge, and experiences. And the Jewish community in Asheville in the late 19th to early 20th centuries worked much the same way. People who had networks from their home countries, or were in the same industries, or became related by marriage, networked the way the internet does today. One of the first of those families we met briefly in the video about Ronald Greene. Lew Pollock and his family were among the first Jewish families on Chiles Avenue. They lived across the park from Greene, which is probably why Greene designed one of Pollack's new shoe stores for him. The Pollacks wouldn't be the first, and I'm not the only one to notice the number of Jewish families on Chiles. Estelle Marder, in her oral history about Jewish life and her family in Asheville, shared that an awful lot of Jewish families lived in Kenilworth. There are many books and presentations out there that cover many families in Kenilworth and Asheville, but we're going to limit ourselves for now just on Chiles Avenue. L.H. Pollock, or Lew as he was known, came to America from Russia in 1902. Several of his family, including siblings, had come on ahead of him, and now it was time for him and his sister Ida to make the journey. His daughter Betty Golden recounts the story of how her father, 15 years old, and Aunt Ida, 10, had to hide in the woods to wait for an unknown man with a wagon to pick them up. When the wagon arrived, a crowd rushed it, and Lew was separated from Ida. He jumped from the wagon, risking losing his chance to escape, and found his sister clinging to a tree. Fortunately, the wagon waited and they made it out safely. In America, a nice woman gave Lew and Ida each a banana, but didn't tell them to remove the peel. It literally left a bad taste in their mouths, as the story goes, and they never ate another. Lew's wife, also Ida, came from London in 1901. Her father, Morris Schultz, was a tailor to Queen Victoria and made gowns for her ladies-in-waiting. Betty claims her mother, Minnie, used to go with her grandfather to the palace to help deliver the clothes, although Minnie would have been less than 4 years old at the time. The Pollacks married while Lew was finding himself and bringing his own job, as those who move here these days are told. Pollack once had a movie theater, said to be where the Woolworth building is now. Ida played the organ for the silent films. She was also involved in the local organizations and led a group called the Sunshine Committee to visit the sick. But the family's success and legacy came from the Pollack chain of shoe stores. First Globe Shoes, and then Pollack Shoes, as well as Cinderella's Slippers, a company they acquired. Pollack's was known for what we call viral marketing ideas today. Dancers in the windows, or acts like Miss Acrobat and the Wax Man, who no one could make laugh or crack a smile. He said he'd only marry when a woman could make him smile, and that's why he wasn't married. Or perhaps that's just what he told his mother about why he hadn't met the right girl. Pollack was best known in the community for a tradition that started in 1911, which he carried on until his death in 1956. Every Christmas, he would give away shoes to needy Asheville children. With the help of local business leaders, nuns, and others, he would line the children up and with an unerring eye walk down the row of seated children, calling out their exact shoe size. If their old shoes were still good enough, they were allowed to take those home. If not, they ended up in a pile. The Pollacks had 4 daughters who grew up in the Chiles Avenue house. I first encountered them in my research through what we'd call social media posts today in the local newspaper. We get a hint of what it must have been like to be Jewish in Asheville from clips like this that discuss all the Christmas holiday activities of Jewish young women. Mildred, the eldest pictured here in her engagement photo, is also shown in this photo in her wedding gown in the living room of their home at 24 Chiles. But it is because of the youngest, Betty Pollack Golden, that I learned so much about the Pollacks and life as a Jewish family in the first half of the 20th century in Asheville. I learned that after the family sold the house and moved, her mother Ida became concerned because she heard it had become a house of ill repute. She had a fit, as Betty put it, and actually went so far as to go investigate. She used the old car trouble ruse to gain access to the house to use the phone. She was horrified. A payphone on the wall and the floors all painted. As you can see from this ad, the house was eventually foreclosed on and repaired and restored. Seems like the Pollack family were the pioneers in historic preservation. When the local public schools proved to be inadequate to prepare their daughters for college, they enrolled them in a local private school, St. Genevieve of the Pines, founded in 1908 by French nuns. Students were expected to follow Catholic religious teachings and traditions, including going through confirmation. But there was plenty of tolerance, and Betty noted she was allowed to skip chapel and answer the phone in the office instead. Roughly only half the student body was actually Catholic, with a quarter being Jewish and a quarter Protestant. Betty noted that she socialized mostly with her Jewish classmates. There were often events held at the local country clubs for her classmates, but they banned Jews. It was something you knew about and lived with, Betty said. There was no real overt anti-Semitism, but many oral histories I read shared that same viewpoint. People engaged in work and business and school together all very cordially, but when the day ended, so did the mixing of people. What some called the segregation at sundown, or the 5 o'clock shadow. Initially, the Asheville Country Club had Jewish families, but as Estelle Marder noted, At the time the country club was started, they needed the money, so they let them in. After that, the membership was closed to Jewish families. Betty shared stories of what it was like during Yom Kippur, also known as the Day of Atonement. It is the holiest day of the year in Judaism. That meant no driving, so the family, as one of the farthest away from the temple, would begin the roughly 3-mile walk, picking up other families along the way. They'd drop their father off at the shul and join him for a bit, before walking back up the hill to the temple. More about that later. We also learn of the struggle to maintain Jewish traditions like keeping kosher. Kosher meat had to be shipped in from out of state, and would often be nearly spoiled by the time it arrived. With only an icebox on the back porch, this was quite a challenge. Eventually, the family switched to non-kosher meat, but Lew told his wife, "Don't tell me when it happens." But he knew anyway, because the night Ida served a non-kosher chicken, she had trouble bringing herself to eat it. Betty shared how during Passover, that while the house was big, it still meant that Lew had to sit at the end of the table, right at the top of the 3 steps that led to the sunroom. The job of the girls was to see to it that he didn't fall back down the stairs. But they also had to keep a sharp lookout on him for another reason. Their tradition was that her father would hide half a matzah, and there was a silver dollar for the child who found one. The youngest child always got a silver dollar, and so she had many that she kept for years. Remember the tolerant nuns from St. Genevieve's? One, Mother Potts, was visiting her girls, as she called them, many years later and was visiting Betty. She'd always wanted to visit the synagogue, and so she was invited during Sukkos, as Betty called it, a harvest festival of celebration. Mother Potts asked if it was okay to keep her veil on in the temple. Betty told her that was fine, but make sure you don't kneel down in the center aisle when you go in, which got a laugh. If you want to know more, Betty Golden's delightful book, Nothing is by Chance, is available on Amazon. Lew Pollock is also associated with the Lew Pollock Memorial Park Cemetery. He was one of the founders of the West Asheville Hebrew Cemetery, which was established to ensure that Jewish people had a place to be buried no matter how poor they were. There was also a second Jewish cemetery section in Riverside Cemetery. Lew was president of the Cemetery Association and spent many years on the upkeep of it, overseeing workers, and because of his dedication and his philanthropy in the community, it was unanimously renamed in his honor. News reports at the time claimed it was the first time in Asheville, and perhaps national history, that a Jewish cemetery was named after a living person. The cemetery was eventually taken over by Temple Beth Israel, and both Lew and Ida Pollock were buried there. The Pollocks definitely made their mark on Asheville. Betty Pollack Golden's book also led me to the Jewish Community Center. It was established in an existing home in 1939 to provide a place for Jewish families, especially young people, to socialize. You'll recall the country clubs were closed to them. This was especially important during World War II, when Jewish GIs and sometimes a friendly Christian would come from Camp Croft in Spartanburg for the weekend. They got a spaghetti dinner at the center and a bed with one of the families in town before taking the bus back. Another example of the welcoming of the stranger-like family that Asheville had already established for itself with its tourism and healthcare industries. One of the boys Betty remembers especially from the center was Zero Mostel, who was drafted and served for a period of time in 1943. They later went and saw him in Fiddler on the Roof on Broadway and were invited backstage to reminisce. Of course, I remember him more from his role in The Producers, which featured a musical parody of Hitler and the Nazis. A musical that Asheville Community Theater happened to be doing a few years back during another outbreak of anti-Semitism and attacks at synagogues around the country. That was my first production with ACT, and each night at the pre-show curtain speech, we made clear that the attitudes of mocking the Nazis and standing against this kind of bigotry was at the heart of our own values. It was an attitude shared by Asheville in an earlier era as well. William Dudley Pelley was your average run-of-the-mill nut job. In 1928, he claims to have gone into what he called an ecstatic interlude for 7 minutes in eternity on the astral plane. It made him reborn, as he put it, into fundamentalist Christianity, which for some reason involved channeling and pyramidism. Also, like most, he developed a gullible following, and some of the wealthier helped him establish a school in Asheville in 1930. He came here because he believed it would be safe from major cataclysmic events. It was here he also wrote articles such as "You Can Remember Before You Were Born." He watched in admiration as Hitler rose to power, and in 1933 he shifted his focus from spiritualism to fascism. He formed the Silver Shirts, whose goal was to, quote, wage the ultimate contest for existence between Aryan mankind and Jewry. And just like other times of economic hardship, the desire for scapegoats meant that Pelley was successful at drawing morons to him. It became one of the largest fascist pro-Hitler groups in the nation, with either 15 or 25,000 members across the country, depending on who you believe. It is said he may have been the author of the phony Franklin prophecy, which claimed to be a diary entry of Ben Franklin, stating we had to protect the new country from the Jews. It is still trotted out by hate groups today, unfortunately. Pelley raised a lot of money which he mismanaged, giving federal authorities a reason to go after him and his group. The FBI raided his offices in 1942. What happened then? Find out next week with the second part of our series, The Jewish History of Chiles Avenue. I told you I promised to keep these videos on the shorter side. Find out what role a member of the Michael Love family played in the outcome. Why did the Perlmans have the fizziest toilets in town? And more. This week I used a lot of resources that I hadn't before, so I did my best to note them so that I could credit and acknowledge and thank them here. Examine them further if you want to know more about the history of Jewish life in Asheville over the last 100 years. And again, any mispronunciations or factual errors were made by me unintentionally, and please know that I did my best. As always, thank you for joining us. There's only a few more episodes of this program to go, so we appreciate you sticking it out with us. We'll see you next week, and please don't forget to support the work of the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe counties.